Good morning, everyone. Welcome, Boker Tov. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Let me just get this hooked up. We'll be back shortly. We'll begin in a couple minutes. Good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. Wonderful to see you. Thumbs up if you can see and hear. Awesome. Thank you so much. Special thank you to Karen Kaplan for sponsoring this morning's shir in memory, 10th yard site of her husband. Neshama should have an aliyah. We should share many happy occasions together, continue to learn together, be well, and we should see each other in person very soon. So it's great to see you, and thank you for that. It's a beautiful dedication. Excited to wish everybody, please God, this week, Shavua Tov and a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. It's going to be a beautiful Yontiv and Mirza Hashem. So much to appreciate, so much to be thankful for this year. Tov Shin Pei Aleph. And we did this a couple of years ago, and I decided it was really such a meaningful opportunity for me to prepare it. And I hope, and I think, based on the feedback, that it was meaningful for those who joined, that we're going to spend some time this morning telling stories. Isn't the night of the Seder about stories? It's L'saper b'Yetzias Mitzrayim, to tell the stories of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of leaving Egypt. But the truth is, there are so many more stories that we tell our children. We tell our children the stories of our youth, of our parents, our Masorah, our tradition, and we tell our story on a national level, not just from Yetzias Mitzrayim, but even since then. And so it's a time to think about stories and to be inspired by stories. So this morning we're going to share stories that relate to the Seder, that relate to Pesach, that hopefully will inspire us to be our best selves. Maybe you want to share these stories, or you want to take those messages and implement them in your lives and in the ways that are meaningful to you. The beginning of the Seder doesn't commence when you sit down at the table. Obviously, it starts much earlier. This year, Erev Pesach Shechal b'Shabbos, so the fast of the Bechorah is going to be on Thursday. We already had the Shabbos HaGadol Drasha for many of us yesterday, or tonight, or tomorrow, whatever it's going to be. We prepare in advance. And that's why it's not surprising that, according to many Mefarshim, the reason why Halach Ma'anya, the first section of the Haggadah, Halach Ma'anya relates to inviting others to our Seder, to taking care of others. It's written in Aramaic because, according to many, Halach Ma'anya was said the week before in the vernacular in Shul. People would say, anybody who wants to participate in a Seder, anybody who needs assistance, come, we'll take care of you. It's about thinking ahead. Halach Ma'anya, if we're only saying for the first time to ourselves, am I taking care of somebody else when I sit down to the Seder? It's not enough. Halach Ma'anya means you have to think in advance. You have to prepare ahead of time. It's got to be in Aramaic. It's got to be meaningful for the people around you. You've got to think ahead. So I saw a beautiful Maisa from one of my most incredible, inspirational role models, the Gaon, the Tzaddik, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman, Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh Livracha, was preparing for Yantif, and he had a nephew who was visiting with him on Erev Pesach. He came to wish him good Yantif. And Rav Shlomo Zalman, some of you know, he lived in Shari Chesed in Yerushalayim, and he had a couple of envelopes. And he said to his nephew who was visiting him, I know you're busy. I know you just came to wish me good Yantif. I wanted to ask if you could do me a favor. You could take these envelopes and deliver them. Each envelope has an address on it where you could take it. If you could please take it there. So the nephew was thinking to himself, the truth is, it's very busy on Erev Pesach. I don't know about anybody else, but Erev Pesach is a crazy day. There's so much going on. Does it have to be that these envelopes? But Shlomo Zalman asked him, and he's not going to argue with his uncle, the Gaon Hador. So he takes the envelopes and he looks at the addresses, and he notices where the neighborhoods are. He's familiar with these streets. So he delivers the envelopes one at a time. And as he gets to these apartments in Yerushalayim, as you can imagine, they're not exactly the nice upscale apartments that you would rent in an Airbnb. They're from very, very impoverished homes. And some of the places where he goes, he knocks on the door. He says, I have an envelope for you from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach from Shari Chesed. The person opens the door, and this is the case. Sometimes they open the envelope in front of this nephew. And guess what is in the envelope? In the envelope he sees are tickets. Tickets to the zoo. Tickets to the biblical zoo and some shekels. Now you can imagine how surprised this nephew was that he's delivering tickets to the zoo on Erev Pesach at like 3:00 in the afternoon. No one's going to the zoo. It's Erev Yantif. So he's very confused. And finally, he decides he's going to get up the courage. So comes the first day of Cholamoid, he goes back to visit his uncle, Shlomo Zalman, and he says to him, with all respect, I just want to understand, Rebbe, please explain to me, why was it so important that I had to go on Erev Pesach at 3 p.m. to deliver tickets? You'll excuse me, but I saw there were tickets to the zoo. Why am I delivering them on Erev Pesach? What Shlomo Zalman said, he says, think about it. What do kids do on the first days of Yantif? In Israel, it's only one day. What do kids do? They go to shul, and they stand outside sometimes bein gavra legavra, or they play in the afternoon in the street, and they talk, and they schmooze. So what do kids talk about on the first day of Yontif? First, they usually talk about how late their Seder was. Yours went till 4:30, mine went to 5 o'clock. But they also talk about what they're going to do on Chol Hamoed. So Shlomo Zalman said, think about the poor children. If they don't have a place, they don't have an activity for Chol Hamoed, not only are they going to be sad on Chol Hamoed, but how are they going to feel on Yontif? When everybody else is talking about what tiyul they're going to take on Chol Hamoed and they have no tiyul planned, they're going to be embarrassed. So Shlomo Zalman said, you need to give them the tickets for the zoo on Erev Yontif, so that they'll be happy on Yontif knowing that they have a place to go on a tiyul. Shlomo Zalman was a gaon in understanding people and understanding that chesed means don't show up at the last second. It means plan ahead. But it's not just that in Holach Ma'anya we think about planning ahead. We have an interesting phrase. We say, Hashata, now we are Avdei L'shana Haba B'nei Chorin. Next year we're going to be free people. Hashata Hacha, now we are here L'shana Haba Ba'ara Yisrael. Next year we're going to be in Israel. So the great Rav Lau, Rav Yisrael Meir Lau, former chief rabbi of Israel, incredibly inspirational manig. He was leading a Seder for several thousand soldiers, chayalim, on a base one year. And they read Holach Ma'anya, and one of the soldiers raised his hand. He said, Kvod Rav, I don't understand, Rav Lau. We say L'shana haba ba'aret Yisrael, next year we'll be in the land of Israel. Right now, we're in the land of Israel. What are we saying? Now we're not. How does this have any meaning? This chayal, this sabra says, I lived my whole life here in the land of Israel. So what are you saying? Next year, I'm going to be in the land of Israel. So Maisa goes like this. Rav Lau thought for a second. And he said, it's a good question. I had a similar question. When I was younger, Rav Lau says, after he escaped Europe, he came to Israel as a boy. And Rav Lau says, I davened several different years in different places for Yom Kippur. He said, I was for Yom Kippur with Reb Lezer Shach, the Ponevezher Rosh Hashiva. I was with Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zichron Livracha, we just spoke about him. And I was with the famous Mashkiach, the great Reb Elia Lapian. Reb Elia Lapian was one of the masters of ethical living. And I was with them on Rosh Hashanah, and I was with them on Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur, I saw Rav Shlomo Zalman, I saw Rav Shach, I saw Reb Elia Lapian clapping al chait, crying and clapping al chait for all these averus. And these averus, there's no way they had done half of the things on that list. They're clapping al chait for things they never did. So what were they doing? So Rav Lau says, you know what I realized? I realized that they were clapping al chait for all of Jews, for the entire Jewish people, for Klal Yisrael. Because they saw themselves connected to all Jews, especially those who weren't going to make it to Shul on Yom Kippur. So Rav Lau said to this young man, the time that this Maisa took place, it was in the late 70s. He says, you know why we're saying L'shana haba ba'aret Yisrael? You're right, it's not for us. But what about for the Jews who are stuck in Soviet Russia? We're saying it for them too, because we're all one people, we're all one family. It's one gigantic Seder. And I would say in the year 2021, what about us? One thing we're thinking about is that we're not physically in Israel. But what about the people who don't yet even aspire to being in Israel next year? We're saying the Haggadah for them to connect to all Jews. Another beautiful Maisa, amazing, powerful Maisa, that we can think about when we get to the four sons. The four sons, we are trying to reach these children. We're trying to inspire them. We're trying to connect to them. And even if it's not them, Of course, it's, as the Sfas Emes points out, it's within us. Each one of us has that child. Each one of us has that little Chacham, that little Rasha, that little Tam, that little Sheni Yodei Lishol. How do we engage ourselves? How do we engage others? So I would encourage us to think about fun. Yiddishkeit is not only fun, it's beautiful, it's happiness, it's meaningfulness, but it's also fun. There's nothing wrong with fun. Nothing wrong with fun. If you're home alone or if it's just the two of you, you can play a fun Seder game. There's nothing wrong with that. So I'll tell you a great Maisa, beautiful Maisa. You know, there was a great Maggid of Yerushalayim. His name is the Maggid of Yerushalayim, Rav Shalom Shvadron. So Rav Shalom Shvadron used to give a drasha in a very chashuv neighborhood in Yerushalayim for great Avreichim, and he used to speak divrei musar. He was a Maggid, a preacher. And he had a signature practice that at the beginning of every drasha, Reb Shalom would tell a joke, would introduce it with something humorous. And everybody would laugh. And Reb Shalom, if you imagined him, I could describe him, have his very long, thin, beautiful white beard, a hadras upon him, and a white Yerushalmi Streimel, Reb Shalom Mordechai. So Reb Shalom Shvadron, he would always start his shir with a joke. He would start with a joke. So one day, there was a couple of guys from the shir, Chashuv Avreichim, and they came over to Reb Shalom after the drasha, and they said to him, Reb Shalom, could you explain to us, why do you need to start with a joke? You don't really have to start with a joke. We're serious people. You don't have to start with a joke. Just get right to the musar. Just get right to the chiddush. So Reb Shalom, he felt kind of bad. He was a little embarrassed. He felt bad. So he decided, what he's going to do? He's going to go talk to the Chazon Ish in Bnei Brak. He's going to meet the Heilige Chazon Ish and ask him what he thinks. And this is what the Chazon Ish said to him. He said, Reb Shalom, Chalila, God forbid, don't stop the jokes. Keep everyone laughing. Reb Shalom said, Rebbe, what's the pshat? So apparently the Chazon Ish said to him, he said, you know that we reach different people in different ways. And when I was growing up in Lithuania, the Chazon Ish came to Israel in the 1930s. When I was growing up in Lithuania, Chazon Ish said, there were a lot of Magidim. There were a lot of preachers. And there were a lot of people who gave different drushes. But you know what? The vast majority of them, they were fire and brimstone and musar and yelling and screaming. And it was so serious. He said, there were a lot of boys for whom that approach, it didn't work. Zelo alach. Chazon Ish says he thinks that there were many boys who didn't stay in the path of Torah mitzvos because for them, Yiddishkeit was not fun. It wasn't geschmack. And therefore, said the Chazon Ish, he said, Reb Shalom, you have to keep making it fun. You have to make it geschmack. And that's something that we can do. Kana ben Shoel, when we address our children or our spouse or ourselves, we've got to make sure that Yiddishkeit is still fun, because there's a little piece of all of us, I think, that appreciates that. Another Maisa that relates to children, not on the fun side, but what does it mean to be a child in the Jewish people? Because being a child has nothing to do with how old you are. That on Chol Hamoed Pesach is the yard site of Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik. I think it's the fourth day of Pesach. So the Rav's yard site is an opportunity to reflect. He passed away in 1993. So it's going to be quite a few years already. So he told over the following Maisa about what it means to be a child from a Jewish perspective. He remembered an episode that happened to him in his childhood in Chaslavich. Chaslavich was a small town in White Russia, where his father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, was the Rav, but there was a significant population of Chassidim in Chaslavich, and the Rav had a Malamed who was a Chabadnik. This Chabadnik was a follower of the Rebbe Rashab, And the Rav was very influenced by this Chabad Melamed because the Chabad Melamed taught him, as he said, how to experience Yiddishkeit, not just how to practice it. So he says this Maisa took place on a winter day in January. He said it was cloudy and it was overcast. And it was shortly after Hanukkah, which meant that it was going to be a long winter. So he was in this little cheder. You can imagine this tiny building with a couple of boys. It was Parshas Vayigash, just after Hanukkah. And now it's the time for what he called, in his words, the monotonous and listless lives that the poor Jews passed. As far as the boys from the cheder were concerned, a long, desolate winter lay ahead. You can imagine what that felt like in that shtetl. On that particular day, all the boys were in a depressed mood, listless, lazy, and sad. We recited, or in the Rav's words, I would rather say chanted mechanically, the first sentence of Parshas Vayigash in a dull monotone. We read mechanically, Vayigash, love Yehuda, and Yehuda came close to him. For those who remember how we used to chant that when we're younger, they said it in Hebrew, they said it in Yiddish. And then they chanted, they got to the pasuk where it says, Hayesh lachem av o ach. And he says, Yesh lanu av zakein, we have an old father. Yesh lanu av zakein v'yelad zekunim. He says, then something strange happened. The Melamed, the teacher, who was half asleep while the boy who was leading the chanting was droning on in Yiddish and Hebrew, he suddenly jumped to his feet with a strange, enigmatic gleam in his eyes. He leaped to his feet like a lion. He usually had velvety blue eyes, but suddenly his eyes became piercing, searching, and investigating. He motioned to the reader to stop, and he turned to me, said the Rav was a little boy. Podrabin, which meant assistant to the rabbi, as he called me whenever he was excited. What kind of father did Yosef ask his brothers? Do you have a father? Of course they have a father. Everybody has a father. The only person who didn't have a father was Alma Rishon, who didn't have a father. What kind of question? I tried to answer. Joseph, I finally said, meant to find out whether the father was still alive. In that case, the Melamed thundered back at me. He should have phrased the question differently. He should have said, is your father still alive? To argue with the Melamed was useless. As he began to speak, he no longer addressed himself to the boys. The impression he gave was that he was speaking to some mysterious visitor, a guest who had come to the cheder into the cold room. Joseph, the Melamed, continued with fervor, was anxious to know whether they felt themselves committed to their roots, to their origins. Are you, Yosef asked the brothers, rooted in your father? Do you look upon him the way the branches or blossoms look upon the roots of the tree? Do you look upon your father as the foundation of your existence? Do you see him as a provider, sustainer of your existence, or just a band of rootless shepherds who forget their muck or their origin? Suddenly, he stopped addressing himself to the strange visitor and began to talk to us. Raising his voice, he asked, are you modest and humble? Do you admit that the old father represents an old tradition? Do you believe that the father is capable of telling something new, etc.? Do you have a father? And he starts shouting at the genius of the group, the Rav described, Yitzhak, who is, what do you say? The Rav's Melamed is shouting at us. Do we have an Av Zakein? Do we look at our parents, the living and those who are in the other world? Do we look at our grandparents? Do we look at our great-grandparents? Do we see ourselves as children of a tradition? The Seder night is about a tradition, so we are children. The Rav's Melamed is yelling at us, relating to the four sons. It's actually thinking about ourselves. Do we consider ourselves children? Because if there's no child at the Seder, we have to ask ourselves, we have to ask our parents, maybe in the other world. It's the time to ask ourselves, Yesh lanu av zakein. Do we feel rooted in our Masorah? The Rav said that impression remained with him for the rest of his life. to ask ourselves, do we have an Avsakin? Weiter in the Seder, we get to the section that describes, Arami Dovidavi describes in brief the sojourn down to Egypt and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved us, and we darshan these psukim, Arami Dovidavi, Vayotzienu, etc. And in the Haggadah, when we are suffering, when we are having this difficulty, in the third pasuk, Vanitzak, 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 we scream out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there is a great Magid, a great Mashpia in Israel and Bnei Brak. His name is Reb Meilech Biederman. I love Reb Meilech Biederman. He has tremendous Sfarim. This year I got the new, it's not so new now, it's new for me, the Haggadah, Be'er HaChaim. I have several of his Sfarim. He has beautiful videos. You can watch and you get them on WhatsApp. Amazing, amazing. So Reb Meilech, he quotes tons of stories. I remember hearing these on one of the WhatsApp videos about Vanitzak. Vanitzak, tonight is the time to scream out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vanitzak is not just in the past. Vanitzak, we can cry out for whatever we need. So he tells a Maisa, Reb Meilech tells a Maisa of a simple Yid living in Poland. He's living in Poland and he owns an inn, a krechma. And as we know, many Jews had krechmalach because they couldn't go into other professions. So this Yid had a big problem. Because, you know, the best way to earn a living in a krechma, in an inn, if you're in the hotel industry, is to have travelers. But one particular winter, it was snowy, frigid, and it was very difficult to travel in that part of Poland. So unfortunately, this krechma owner, he leased the krechma from the local poritz, and the poritz is going to ask him, come April 15th, he wants his annual rent. But this little Yid, he has no way of paying the bill because he didn't have enough customers. He has all the schnapps. He couldn't sell anything. Nobody came over the whole winter. He didn't know what to do. And you know what happens if you show up to the poritz without paying your full rent? Achen vei, or worse. So he decided he's going to go to the Heilige Saraf of Moglenitsia. The Sarf of Moglenitsa was a grandson, he was a great Chassidic master in his own right. He was a grandson of the holy Kozhnitzer Magid. He was known as the Saraf. So this Yid he's going to go to Moglenitsa for Shabbos HaGadol to ask the Rebbe what to do. And he arrives at the Rebbe, his name is Reb Chaim Meir Yechiel, known as the Saraf. So Reb Chaim Meir Yechiel is busy Shabbos HaGadol, and the Gabbai tells this poor Yid, he says, I'm sorry, you can't get to the Rebbe. There's no time. We have too many appointments. It's too busy. It's Shabbos HaGadol. He doesn't have time. The guy says, okay. He's going to go to listen to the Rebbe Shabbos afternoon. He's going to give the Shabbos afternoon, Shabbos HaGadol drasha. So in the afternoon, the Saraf gets up and he starts giving a beautiful drasha, lahavas eish, impassioned, moving everyone, thinking, inspiring. And he's telling everybody that on the night of the Seder, you can ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for anything. You can ask for anything. Especially when it gets to the words of the Seder, Vanitzach Kel Hashem. We cried out to God, you can ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for anything. So this Yid, he's a simple Jew. He's a Ma'aminim b'nei Ma'aminim. He says, obviously, the Saraf, Reb Chaim Meir Yechiel, was talking to him. So he goes home and he tells his wife and all his children that we have to do exactly what the Saraf told us. When we get to the portion of Vanitzak in the Seder, we have to start crying out. We have to scream to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Vanitzak HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please help us and save us. Please save us. We had a terrible winter. We need money to pay the poritz. V'kach hava. That's what he does. He has his kinderlach at the table. He has his wife. Whatever meager Seder they're able to put together. They get to Vanitzak and they start crying. We say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please help us. And they start talking and screaming and asking and begging for a while. Meanwhile, about 20 minutes into their crying out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Vanitzak, Vanitzak, Vanitzak. There's an insane knock at the door. There's a guy pounding at the door. The Yid opens the door of the Kretschma, and lo and behold, there's a guy from a nearby town who he recognizes, a guy who he had seen many times come by the inn for a drink. And he had a rapport with this guy. Well, that night, the guy had a little too much to drink, and he got into a fight with his wife, and he picked up a chair, and excuse me, Lo Aleinu for saying this, he hit his wife with a chair, and she collapsed, and she died, just then and there. So meanwhile, this guy knows the police are going to come and arrest him, and they're going to take him away. So he collects all of his money, and he puts it in 2 canisters, and he bangs on the door at that moment, and he says to this Kretschma owner, this Pashut Yid, he says, I know you're a trustworthy guy. I've been here many times. I have an emergency. I got to get out of town. I have something that I need you to watch. I have 2 canisters. They have something valuable in them. One of them is for you for safekeeping, that it's yours to keep on the condition you're watching the second one. And if for some reason something happens and I don't come back, you can keep the second one. So the guy doesn't know what's in there. He takes the canisters. He says, no problem. I'll put them in the safe in the kitchen. He puts them in the safe in the kitchen, and the guy runs out. He leaves. They continue their Seder. A couple days later, right after Yontif, Chol Hamoed, the guy goes to open the safe, and he looks in them, and he sees 2 canisters. They're full of rubles, thousands and thousands of rubles. And later in the day, there's a knock on the door. 2 local police constables, 2 policemen come by, and they say, we have a quick question to ask you. Did you know there was a guy who lived in the next town who we found dead in the river? Could you come identify him? And the Yid says, okay, I'll come. They haul him out. They take him to the side of the river, and there's the guy. He's dead. He drowned in the river. And the little Yid, he looks up to the Baruch Shalom, he says, thank you, Vanitzak. Vanitzak. Movsim. These stories happen in Poland. I don't know how. I don't know what to tell you. All I know is this is the Maisa. This is the Maisa. So Melech says he knows that this Maisa, he describes in the Haggadah, he says, there are hundreds and thousands of Maisim like this that happen all the time. He says there's a man that he knows who has had multiple elderly sons who had never had any shidduch prospects, and they decide they were going to scream Vanitzak. He tells another Maisa about a Bacher, an alter Bacher. His name is Reb Manish. Manish, he sits at the Seder and he bangs on the table. He says to everyone, why can't I get married? We're going to scream Vanitzak. I don't know. All I can tell you, I don't know how it works. All I can tell you is that Reb Melech says there are lots of Maisim. A lot of Maisim, like this Saraf of Mogalanitza, like this poor Yid, like these alter Bachrim and Bnei Brak, Vanitzak. It's the night where we cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Let's move ahead to talk about matzah. Two stories on matzah. The first story is a quick story that obviously is very apropos to the Heiliger Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Reb Levi Yitzchak, he was one of Mamish, the holiest of the holy, and he was very scrupulous, very careful about baking matzahs. And matzah baking is a sensitive topic because, you know, there's just a tiny little window. There's no room for error. It's this thin, just this thin between matzah on one side, kosher l'mahadrin, versus chametz on this side, iser kares, Rahman al-Islam. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak used to go always before Pesach and supervise the baking of the matzahs. And one year, he wasn't feeling well, so he told his gabbai that he couldn't go for the matzah baking tomorrow. So a couple of chassidim came running 5 minutes later. They banged on the door. They said, Rebbe, we have to talk to you. What do you need to know? He says, we are going to go and supervise the matzah baking tomorrow. So what do we need to be extra machmir for? What do we have to watch out for to create the most mehuredik matzah, that it should be according to all the stringencies? So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak says, I'll tell you. This is where I'm most machmir. You know who works in the matzah bakery? You know those women? The elderly Russian ladies who work in the matzah bakery? They're very poor. And the guys who are running the operation, they're not always the most generous or sensitive or thoughtful. And there's a lot of pressure on these women to prepare the matzah. And sometimes, you'll excuse me, the men who are running around in the matzah bakery are yelling, and they get upset at these poor women. You know what the most important chumrah is for baking matzahs? It's that nobody get angry, and that nobody yell at the women who are baking the matzahs. Anybody, the Rebbe said, the Berditchever said, anybody who yells at the poor women who are baking matzahs, they make the matzah into chametz. The biggest chumrah is the bein adam lachavero, of how you treat other people. Lots of people have lots of hidurim, but the Berditchever says, the greatest hidur is bein adam lachavero. And a similar ma'aseh with the Heilige Shvus Yaakov. Rav Yaakov Reisher, if you see on the side of the Shulchan Aruch, the Mefarshim often quoting Yoredeya, the Minchas Yaakov, or the Chuvas of the Shvus Yaakov, one of the very most important poskim after the time of the Ramah, early 18th century. The Shvus Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Reisher, was once giving a Shabbos HaGadol drasha. And he came to the shul on Shabbos afternoon, and it was a 2.5 hour ornate halachic presentation with the exact details of the minimum shear of achilas matzah. And it was an intricate, detailed shear of how do you figure out what's the size of a kazayas. Is it the Chazon Ish? All right, that's anachronistic. Chazon Ish lived much later. The Chazon Ish shear of kazayas, or is it like the size of your hand, how thick the matzah is, crushing the matzah, all the details. And people lined up afterwards and they gave him a shkoyach, harav, thank you so much. Fascinating, thought-provoking, interesting. And one man who didn't really say much to the Rebbe, kind of a haggard-looking fellow, comes up after him and says to the Heilige Shvus Yaakov, he says, Rabbi, I have a little bit of a kasha on your shir. And that is that didn't really speak to me so much. Because to me, I can't afford any matzah for my Seder at all. And so my nafkamina, whether the minimum shir of matzah is like this, or the minimum shir of matzah is like this, my nafkamina, because our family can't afford any matzah this Pesach. It's too expensive. So the Shvus Yaakov looks at this man, this poor person, and he sees the man has a tear in his eye. The Shvus Yaakov runs back to the podium and he bangs on the stender, and he says, I have to make an announcement. I have to be mashlim the shir. So everybody's excited. They get to hear more limud, more lamdus. So the Rav's going to continue. So they look, everyone's waiting. What's he going to be mashlim? Maybe someone has the kasha. The Shvus Yaakov says to everyone, Rabbosai, my shir is upgefrekt. My shir is shlugged up, as you'd say in Yiddish. It's proven wrong. You know what the shir of achilas matzah is at the end of the day? It's to ensure that every single family in our community has enough food and matzah to eat for Pesach. That's the shir for achilas matzah. To make sure that everyone has matzah. It's the bein adam lachavero of achilas matzah. Pesach, the whole night is nama. It's the meichla de mehemnusa. It's the belief that we had in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the emuna. We have emuna in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what it's a night of emuna. The Korban Pesach was all about the fact that the people had emuna that they were going to leave. And we can have emuna as well. We need to have emuna. That emuna comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Emuna in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'll share with you two maislach, one related to Pesach, one to Nishmas, from the great, incredible, inspirational figure who we lost just a few weeks ago, Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twersky. Dr. Shia Twersky describes, he was once in Manhattan. He has a great line in this Maisa, for those of you who have ever been to Manhattan. He says, I was once stuck in Manhattan, and I have to tell you, I don't like getting stuck in Manhattan. I guess it's because he's a Midwesterner like us. He was from Milwaukee. He said, I think Manhattan was a mistake. The Etzem Manhattan, he thinks it was a mistake. The whole city was a mistake. Okay. He says, I had a really rough day and I wasn't feeling good. And you know what I thought, says Rabbi Dr. Twersky? He says, I thought if I went to an AA meeting, I would get a big lift. He was a very big chassid. He was a very big proponent of AA, of Alcoholics Anonymous. So he found out that this was a lunchtime AA meeting nearby because he called the central office to find out where the local meeting is. And so there was actually one not far. So he walked to one of the meetings. And he gets to the meeting, and there was a woman who was speaking there. And he says, I've heard the same story 100,000 times. She was young, and unfortunately, she started using alcohol. And then she started with marijuana, and then other drugs, and her lifestyle deteriorated, and she fell into Rahman al-Islam. And then when she was 26 or 27, somebody brought her into the recovery program, and now she's sober and things are getting better. Rabbi Twersky said, Dr. Twersky, Zechron Levracha, said, that story didn't do anything for me. I've heard it 1,000 times. But then she said this. Before I leave, I have to tell you one thing. She said, I'm a big football fan. And I'm a fan of the New York Jets. Now, I have Rachmanis, by the way, just editorially for anybody who's a Jets fan. I know it's not an easy thing. So maybe there's a Jets fans anonymous oichet for that. Okay, but that's a separate Maisa. She says, I never miss a Jets game. And one weekend I was out of town, but I didn't want to miss the game. So I asked my girlfriend to record the game on her VCR. Baruch Hashem, most of us in this group, we know what a VCR is, that plastic thing. Okay, Baruch Hashem, at least that I can tell you that I remember VCRs. 8 tracks, no, but VCR, yes. Okay. So I asked my girlfriend to tape the game on the VCR. When I came back, I went to pick up the tape. And as she handed me the VCR tape, she said, oh, by the way, the Jets won. Okay. So I get home and I put the tape in and I start watching. And the Jets are getting clobbered. They're playing horrible. By halftime, they're down 21 points. And what would have happened in other circumstances? She says, in other circumstances, I would have been a nervous wreck. I would have been screaming at the television. I would have been pacing the floor. I would have been in the fridge 50 times. But this time, I sat there perfectly calm because I knew they were going to win. She says, ever since I came into this program of AA, I turned over my life to the will of God. And I know it's going to turn out all right. Sometimes I'm 20 points behind at halftime, but I know in the end, it will turn out all right. Whatever that is. Dr. Twersky said it was such an incredible, powerful lesson for him in Emunah. How many times are we stuck in a situation that nothing seems to be going right, and that all we need to do is to turn our lives over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Somehow or another, it's going to work out. I don't know. I don't understand. But in the end, there's somebody who's taking care of it. In the end, the Jets did and will win. He has a related Maisa, not so much on the idea of Emunah, but on the idea of Nishmas in particular. Because, Nishmas is that song, that Shira, that relates to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in all the steps and all the stages of the Geula. Mimitzrayim, Galtanu, etc., etc. So he said he was once sitting on a Sunday afternoon he was watering the plants in his front yard in Pittsburgh. He was watering the lawn and the plants, and it was a lousy day. He was in a bad mood. And part of, by the way, what I love about Rabbi Dr. Twersky is his mamish so real. And that if he's having a lousy day, it's okay to say he's having a lousy day, even if you're a world-renowned psychiatrist. He was in a bad mood. And guess what? A car drives up, pulls up in front of his house, honks, and 2 guys jump out. 2 guys get out. They're former patients of Rabbi Twersky in Gateways in the rehab center, who had recovered and graduated treatment for alcoholism. They jumped out and they said, how you doing, doc? He said, normally under regular circumstances, to regular people, you know what you say? You say, I'm fine. But Rabbi Twersky had a principle that he would never lie to people in the recovery program. He would never say anything to them that was not absolutely true, because you expect them to be honest with you, and you have to be honest with them. So he said to them, pretty lousy, it's been a rough day. So you know what they said to him? Like this last story, they said, you should come with us to the AA meeting. He said, no, thank you. No, thank you. That night at 8:00, bing dong, the doorbell rings. And guess what? It's the 2 guys there to take him to the AA meeting. Of course, he didn't need the AA meeting, but he's going to go. He's going with them. And he went to the AA meeting feeling really depressed. And it was his mazel that it happened to be a gratitude meeting. And what happens at an AA gratitude meeting? Everybody goes around and says, I've been sober for 6 years and my life is so much better and everything is, et cetera, one person after the next. And he said the truth is that's not what he needed to hear. He was in such a bad mood. Finally, the last guy gets up and he says the following. I've been sober for 4 years, and I wish I could tell you that they've been good. But my company downsized and I lost my job and I couldn't find another one. I fell behind on my mortgage payments, so they foreclosed on my house. My wife left me and she took custody of the kids after we divorced. And last week, the finance company repossessed my car. But I can't believe God brought me all this way only to walk out on me now. That's what the man said. God brought me all this way to walk out on me now. And Rabbi Twersky said, Dr. Twersky said, then he knew why he was at that meeting. That's why I was here. Because he said that Shabbos when he said, Nishmas, Mi Mitzrayim Galtanu, you took us out of Egypt, you fed us during the famine, you sustained us, you rescued us, you delivered us. Ad heina lo azavun rachamecha v'lo azavunu chasadecha. You will never forget us. You will never forsake us. I've been saying, Rabbi Twersky said he was 55 years old when he had this story. He said, I had been saying this tefillah of Nishmas, and I never heard that before. I never understood what I was saying. That what we're saying is that God, you will never forsake us. That you brought us all this way, and you will never walk out on us now. Even if it's a difficult time, even if it's matzah and maror, Hashem, you will never walk out on us. It's not possible. Getting toward the end, we're running out of time. Just a couple of three last Maisalach. The first one is a short Maisa that Rabbi Pesach Kron tells about Rav Shalom Shvadron when he got to Tzafon. Tzafon is eating the afikomen. You know, many people are makbid. Make sure to eat the afikomen before Chatzos. One sheet in the Tanaim and the Rishonim, the Chumrah and the Shulchan Aruch. It's best l'chatchila to eat before Chatzos. So one year, the Heilige Magid of Yerushalayim, Rav Shalom Shvadron, was at the Seder with Rabbi Pesach Kron. So Rabbi Kron is sitting at the Seder with he had an elderly mother. His father passed away when he was much younger. And he was watching the clock and he started to hurry his children so that they could get through their Divrei Torah at Magid, so they could finish before Chatzos, to get to the Afikomen before Chatzos. And at one point, Reb Shalom looked over to him very sternly and said, slow down, stop. Don't rush the kids. So Rabbi Kron said, okay. And then a few minutes later, he's looking at his watch again and he's rushing. So Reb Shalom pulls him aside. He says, stop rushing. We're going to eat the afikomen whenever we get there. So lo and behold, they missed Chatzos. They got to the afikomen much later. And Rabbi Kron said he was very agitated. He didn't know what to say. Like, come on, it's not right. It's not right. So he asked the Maggid afterwards, says, what's going on? The Maggid said to him very sternly, you know, he was a jovial man, but he said to him very sternly. He asked him, he says, where are your priorities? Where are your priorities? To finish eating the afikomen before Chatzos, that's a chumrah midrabanan. But to gladden the heart of an almana, of your mother, who looks forward a whole year to hear your kids say their Divrei Torah, you know, they're rattling it off the page. My Rebbe told me this, my Rebbe told me that. The other kids don't care. I'm not sure if the parents care, but the grandparents, that's all they look forward to all year. That kibbut aveim, that's d'oraisa. That's a biblical fulfillment. Don't worry so much about finishing on time for itself. Keep your priorities straight. Know when taking care of another person, when kibbut aveim is d'oraisa and what's d'rabbanan. L'shana haba, next year in Yerushalayim, I could forward it to you. Incredible description that the Heilige Reb Yosef Mendelevich describes what it was like making a Seder in the Shistopol prison. To say that next year in Yerushalayim, to have faith, to believe, and to aspire to being in Zion, to be in Asir Zion, to wish we were, to make plans to go on Aliyah, to think about Israel. He was in Shistopol, which was a difficult prison. It's already 9 years into his prison sentence. It was the 10th year of his incarceration. And he was there a month before Pesach with another Asir Tzion by the name of Hillel Butman. And he said to Hillel, he says, you know what? I think we should make preparations for a Seder. He says, Seder in Siberia? What are you, crazy? It's not happening, not possible. So he said he had to make the Pesach Seder preparations by himself. So he did. Believe it or not, he was fortunate that he had kept with him a postcard from Israel. And in that postcard, on it, there was a picture of a Seder plate. So now at least he knew what a Seder plate would look like. So he needed 4 cups of wine. There's no wine in the gulag. But his father had given him years earlier raisins. So he took the raisins and he got some water and he made it into wine that he had saved. What about horseradish? Well, there was an outbreak of influenza, and the Russians had thought that onions were good for influenza, so they got a piece of onion. What about karpas? So they went for a prison walk, and he saw that when they went out onto the prison, there was a small green leaf growing in the asphalt. And he took it out and he says, oh, that's going to be perfect for karpas. He made an egg from egg powder. I could go on and on. It's a long story. We don't have time. He got the Pravda newspaper and he shaped it into a matzah plate. And believe it or not, that night, the night of Tesvav B'Nisan, after hiding everything for days and weeks, he put the newspaper out and he made a Seder plate. And he did hold a halachically correct Pesach Seder in the prison. Believe it or not, the next morning, other members of his group from Operation Wedding were freed and emigrated to Israel, but he had to wait for another 2 years. But he said that when Hillel Butman arrived in Israel, he told everyone how this man, Yosef Mendelevich, was able to still make a Pesach Seder in the Russian Gulag. Because we can always say under any circumstance, L'shana haba ba'arad Yisrael, even though he didn't make it the following year, he kept that dream alive. He kept that dream alive of the onion and the poultry egg made out of powder, and of the parsley that he picked up, not parsley, grass root. What it means to believe in the dream of going back to Tziyah. And one last meiser for Chol HaMoed. A man once came to visit the Tzaddik of Yerushalayim, Rabbi Levin, and he saw Rabbi Levin was getting ready to go out in the morning. He said to him, where are you going? He said, oh, I'm going to meet Rebbetzin Bengis. What do you mean? There was a great Talmud Chacham, a great Gaon from Europe who lived in Yerushalayim. His name is Reb Zelig Reuven Bengis. And he had passed away. And Rabbi Ari said, you know, Reb Zelig Reuven Bengis was a Gaon Adri, he was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. And people used to come and ask him shilas and visit him. And Yontif was always a busy week in their house. But you know, since he passed away, it's quiet. So you know what I've done? I've decided to make it my practice that every year on Chol HaMoed, I go visit all of the Rebbetzins who are living alone. Because I understand what their house used to be like, and I want to make sure that it's a little bit busier, that somebody's thinking of them, somebody's visiting with them. What does it mean to have Simchas Yontif, the Rambam says, is to be masameach others, to make sure that others have gladness. So to review very quickly our 12 Maisalach from today, we talked about Halach Ma'anya, thinking ahead with Chesed, to plan ahead like Rosh Zalman does for Erev Yontif with the children and the tickets for the zoo. And Rav Lau thinking about saying the Halach Ma'anya for others, we're connecting with Klal Yisrael. The Ravs reminding us, V'kana ben Shoel, the 4 sons, do we have a father? Are we connected to Yisrael Saba? The 4 sons having fun, making sure that we have fun at the Seder, like the Chazon Ish said to Reb Shalom Shvadron. Vanitzak, opening our hearts and really crying out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this simple Yid dealing with the Poritz and the Seraph of Mogul Nitza. The Matzah with Reb Levi Yitzchak's Kavana to make sure Bein Chavero to treat other people nicely. That's the greatest Chumrah. And the Shvus Yaakov making sure that everybody has Matzah. Emuna and Nishmas, the stories from Dr. Twersky of his AA meetings, to realize, to remember that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's taking care of everything. So we know at the end of the game, the Jets win. Don't worry. At the end of the game, the Jets win. And to realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will not ever, even if it's difficult. Sofun, to remember our priorities, that sometimes what the halacha requires in one context needs to be informed by a halacha from a different context. Taking care of this grandmother. L'shana haba be'eretz Yisrael, ba'arad Yisrael, b'Yerushalayim habenuya, aspiring and dreaming and making that Pesach Seder even in the Gulag, and finally remembering to think about what it means to be mesameach others on Chol HaMoed. I thank everybody for coming.